The Puget Sound region is lucky to have a growing regional transportation network featuring both Link Light Rail and Sounder commuter trains. Intercity rail is woefully undervalued in the United States. Most Americans are not going to experience being able to head down to a train station, hop on board, and simply go somewhere without worrying about getting gas, getting stuck in traffic, or finding parking. Rail travel is such a comfortable way to get around that this honestly feels like a luxury compared to what can be found elsewhere. It cannot be overstated just how important it is to have a functioning rail system. Cars are atrociously inefficient at moving people, and this is evidenced by the land use of Interstate 5 versus the Link Light Rail. In 2019, the Link Light Rail would attract around 80,000 daily boardings. Ridership levels took a massive hit during the COVID-19 pandemic, but it has largely recovered. The record number of boardings for Link Light Rail was set on July 23rd, where 136,800 people boarded for a Taylor Swift concert. This should give a rough idea of the maximum daily throughput of the current light rail system, and yet, the maximum capacity can still be increased by running larger trains at a greater frequency. The land use for even more riders wouldn't change either. It would still require 2 rail lines, one for trains traveling northbound and one for southbound. Meanwhile, Interstate 5 has a whopping 12 lanes just to move 288,000 vehicles per day. And with how congested the corridor is, it's not exactly possible to increase throughput without widening it. A cramped train is uncomfortable, but it should, for the most part, arrive at the stations within the same amount of time as if the train were empty. Furthermore, the land use required for a station is fairly small. Meanwhile, it is not too uncommon for a freeway to have a spaghetti mess of on-ramps and off-ramps to accommodate all of the vehicles. When it comes to moving a lot of people, it's a lot better to invest in transit than freeways. While Link Light Rail managed to bounce back after the pandemic, the same cannot be said about Sounder trains. This year, Sounder has been seeing just under 7,000 daily boardings, which, while better than last year's ridership metrics, is still less than half of 2019 levels. Part of the reason for this trend is because Sounder is only really useful for commuters who travel from the suburbs to Seattle for a 9 to 5 weekday office job. The South Sounder line runs between Seattle and Tacoma. When traveling southbound, there are 3 trips in the morning and 10 trips in the afternoon. The inverse is true for the northbound direction. There are 10 morning trips and only 3 afternoon trips. This makes it so the route isn't particularly helpful when traveling in the opposite direction of commuters. If you missed your 8:20 a.m. train from Auburn to Tacoma, don't worry, there'll be another one in 7 hours. Despite these drawbacks, the South Line is almost good. It just needs more service in the opposite directions and weekend service. Meanwhile, the North Sounder line is nowhere near as useful. There are 2 southbound trips in the morning and 2 northbound trips in the afternoon, so it only really exists for people traveling from Everett to Seattle, but not the other way around. There's also the option to take Amtrak Cascades trains, which actually does run on weekends. So if you're dead set on riding a train from Seattle to Everett on a weekend, you're not completely out of luck, assuming the train isn't fully booked. When far more trains run in one direction than the other, it only furthers the impression that Sounder is a rail line for commuters, and it is not really helpful for any other kind of trip. There may be some exceptions, such as there being extra trains during sports events, but for the most part, this is a rail line for people who live in the suburbs and commute to Seattle for their office job. This model worked prior to 2020, but as we made our way through the COVID-19 pandemic, companies were forced to adopt work-from-home policies. A lot of the trips that used to take public transit shifted to remote work instead. Currently, a quarter of Seattle residents work from home, which is greater than most metro areas. And honestly, can you really blame them for not coming back? It's not just about being able to skip the commute. Working from home provides far more flexibility than working in an office space. That flexibility allows you to run errands, gives you more time with family, and just makes it easier to balance your work from your life. It's possible that once Link Light Rail Line 2 fully opens, people who work at offices in Redmond and Bellevue will shift to taking Sounder and transferring at King Street Station. But for now, people may prefer to drive directly to the office on the few days they actually need to be there. In an attempt to attract more riders, Sound Transit is investing $350 million into new parking structures at 3 Sounder train stations. As I have mentioned before, park and rides aren't inherently bad. It's better for suburbanites to be taking the train into the city than driving to it. However, it does double down on the idea that this is a rail line that is only useful for suburban commuters. Adding more parking only really helps these suburbanites who drive to the park and ride to get on the train, and currently, the only station that regularly hits max capacity is the Sumner station. Meanwhile, the current garage in Auburn was 58% full in April, and the parking garage in Kent was only 43% full. So these stations do not appear to require any additional parking. It seems like an awful lot of money to throw into parking garages that are going to be half empty or less for most of the week, and completely empty for the 2 days per year that these trains are not in operation. It's also pretty awful for land use. If someone gets off of a station and they are greeted with a massive parking structure and no points of interest in walking distance, then the station and the area surrounding it feels less appealing. It's not much of a destination. It also takes away land that could be used for housing developments next to the train station. So people who want to live car-free have fewer places they can live and still be within walking distance of a train station. For the sake of fairness, these parking garages were already approved by voters back in 2008. So Sound Transit is really just following through with a voter-approved plan from over a decade ago. However, these plans were created at a radically different time for Sounder trains. It is unlikely that the office workers who used to ride Sounder will return. In fact, some of Sound Transit's board members are doubtful that ridership will ever recover to 2019 levels. Board member and Tacoma City Council member Christina Walker, for example, said, "Now I feel like we're at a point where I don't think this is going to come back to where it was. It's still a vital service, but we have to revisit our assumptions." On the bright side, Sounder's ridership woes presents an opportunity to reimagine the corridor, so it can better service more people. It would be great to see these trips staggered so trains can run throughout the day and on weekends, instead of concentrating on peak hours Monday through Friday. Perhaps instead of the South Line running every 20 minutes in the morning, it would run at least hourly in the northbound and southbound directions, trading that frequency for being able to run more often in the short term, and hopefully being able to regain that original frequency as the line becomes more popular. The North Line may also benefit from adding more stations within Seattle as well. In the Seattle Transportation Plan, SDOT identified several candidates for infill stations that could interface with future Link Light Rail expansions. Building these stations, especially the one in Ballard and the one in downtown, would help allow the North Sounder line service more places. In addition, after the Sound Transit 3 expansion adds Link Light Rail service to Tacoma and to Everett, it may be worth consolidating the North and South Sounder lines into one continuous line that travels from one end to the other, hitting all of these stations. That way, these new infill stations would be useful for more people than just those who are traveling from Ballard or downtown up to Everett. As of right now, the fundamental problem is that Sounder trains just aren't useful for enough people. Future investments to boost Sounder's ridership needs to address this part of the problem. Unfortunately, there is a major obstacle that impedes any meaningful improvement to the service, and that's BNSF. Passenger rail in the United States rarely gets its own dedicated right-of-way. Typically, the tracks are owned by one of 4 freight companies, and they generally prefer to reserve these tracks for their own freight trains. Consequently, Sounder train service cannot simply be staggered or added. Before anything changes, they must negotiate with BNSF, and these negotiations can be sensitive and costly. Back in 2003, to launch the voter-approved North Sounder line, Sound Transit had to pay $258 million to operate trains along that segment. Later, to add 4 round trips between Seattle and Tacoma in 2013, Sound Transit had to pay $185 million. Suddenly, the price of parking garages is dwarfed when looking at the cost to get permission to run trains on the tracks. These costs force Sound Transit to prioritize trips that they believe will have the most riders, leading to Sounder being a useful route for office workers who live in the suburbs and not particularly helpful for others. A lot of passenger rail systems in the country share this exact issue. They are at the mercy of one of 4 freight companies, so passenger rail services don't get nearly as much control over their routes as they should. This makes it a lot more difficult to start new rail services or expand existing ones. This also diminishes the quality of passenger rail. Amtrak Cascades is a state-run service between Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver, Canada. According to Amtrak's Host Railroad Report Card, this route has an on-time performance of 56%. It's typically worse for long-distance routes such as Coast Starlight and Empire Builder. It is estimated that freight trains delayed Amtrak riders by 1.1 million minutes in 2022. Meanwhile, the rail lines that are actually hosted by Amtrak are typically on time at least 80%. As much as I would want to see Sounder improve, fixing this part of the problem is beyond the scope of what Sound Transit can accomplish. This is one of the reasons some people stress that we must nationalize the US railroads, so it can prioritize the quality of both freight and passenger rail services instead of having 4 companies that practically own a monopoly on most of the tracks. A nationalized rail system would function similarly to the interstate highway system. There is no profit motive for dumping hundreds of millions into building, widening, or maintaining freeways. It is done because there are a lot of perceived benefits to having a functioning transportation system. A nationalized rail system would apply the same reasoning to both freight and passenger rail. Rather than prioritizing quarterly profits that would make investors happy, the government would be responsible for building and maintaining rail infrastructure for both passenger and freight trains. This would also benefit services like Sounder because, rather than being at the mercy of privately owned freight companies, they could work directly with the government to expand existing services or build new passenger rail services entirely. Rather than paying a private company hundreds of millions of dollars to run trains on their tracks, the funds can go directly to track improvements and creating new passenger rail right-of-ways entirely. The alternative would be having the state buy out tracks or build new tracks to provide dedicated right-of-way to passenger rail. In fact, Sound Transit does own an 18-mile segment of tracks south of Tacoma where Sound Transit and Amtrak Cascades can bypass the BNSF freight traffic. This is a step in the right direction. But until there is a fundamental change to the way passenger rail is operated in this country, it is unlikely that we will see a substantial improvement to Sounder trains.